Hi, David.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I guess I rise to that level. I'm pretty good. Yeah, I'll go that far. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You're David Bornstein. And you are, among other things, the co-founder and CEO of the Solutions Journalism Network. We're going to be talking about journalism, the state of journalism. You also wrote a book, How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas.
Yeah.
Which is said to have been published in many languages. Is that true?
That's true. About
How
20.
many? 20? That's pretty good.
Actually, I think it's like 22 now.
That's pretty good.
And I wrote another book before that called The Price of a Dream, which was about the Grameen Bank.
Ah, yes, the Grameen Bank. Well, maybe if we have time left over, we'll get into the Grameen Bank. Okay. But let's start with journalism and what's wrong with it, if anything, and what can be done about what's wrong with it. And the various views on that. This conversation will also, I think, to some extent, pick up on themes from a conversation I posted not that long ago with Zachary Karabell, who is starting something I think called the Progress Network, and that was about kind of the relative merits of an optimistic and pessimistic view of the world situation, or just the relative merits of emphasizing the positive as opposed to emphasizing the negative. And that's very much a view on that is I think very much entailed in what you're doing and in your decision to start the Solutions Solutions Journalism Network. Do I?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. If I get it wrong, correct me. So let's talk about a piece you co-authored in the New York Times with Tina Rosenberg, who is co-founder of I guess we can say SJN for short.
Yeah.
With you, and she is a distinguished journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner. I think she won a MacArthur Genius Award, if I recall.
She also won the National Book Award.
There you go, the trifecta.
National Book Critics Circle too.
I don't know what they call that. I don't know what lies beyond the trifecta. But, and it was a piece about how journalism was, tell me if I'm going too far, but was in some sense complicit in Trump's getting elected. This, of course, the word complicit assumes that you think Trump's getting elected is a bad thing. Not everyone does. Probably neither you nor I voted for him. In any event, you saw a role played by kind of the way journalism is done, right? You want to tell us what the thesis of that piece was?
Yeah, the basic idea is that journalism created a context where sort of the seeds that Trump was scattering took root very easily. Like when he was, telling people, running around the country telling people that crime is at a 40-year high, it was almost at that time at a 40-year low. The fact that people didn't know that automatically and say this is ridiculous is because people have a tough time discerning that fact. It's not. You have to sort of hunt the news for information that lets you know that crime has declined, for example. Even when it's declined for 20 years straight, if it takes a small uptick from one year to the next, the story is that crime is up. And so you can see that with lots of the coverage of lots of issues. The sort of what we call the narrative of brokenness being sort of a core part of journalist theory of change, the idea that, what's missing in terms of fixing our problems is there's not sufficient outrage, there's not sufficient awareness about the problems. People don't care enough, they don't feel that they're urgent enough, and so we constantly have to make sure that nobody ever gets complacent. But the other risk associated with that sort of narrative focus is that people have a very distorted sense of reality and are prey to people who want to take advantage of their fears and prey on their resentments and things like that. And I think journalism created a context, a distortion in people's perception of reality that not only Trump, but people like Bolsonaro and people, Modi in India and people advancing Brexit had used journalism to their advantage and continue to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess if I were to assign myself the role of defending journalism, or at least try to present what I think is the kind of a standard defense of journalism's alleged tendency to emphasize the negative, it would be that The negative things are the things that need fixing. They are the things that need calling attention to. If the crime rate's going down, then that means you're doing the right thing. We don't really need to intervene, would be the argument, right? Whereas if the crime rate's going up, we need to really focus attention on that and change something about the policing or the courts or something. That would be the argument.
Right, but if the crime rate is going down, first of all, it's never going down the same everywhere. There's always places that it's going down first and better and for different reasons. The question of why is the crime rate going down, how are people, why are certain hospitals safer than others? Why are certain schools better than others? Why are certain communities doing a better job dealing with opioids or meth or whatever than others? Where things are being solved, the question of how are people doing it and what's actually happening turns out to be really crucial information, because there's always massive performance variation. I mean, you can find probably, if you talk about the performance variance, like the United States has, over 5,000 hospitals. Some of those hospitals, if you get sepsis, you're probably not going to die, and others you probably will. And the difference is that they're doing different things. They have different awareness. I mean, for journalists to be able to report on not only how problems exist, how they get exacerbated or how they get ignored or neglected, but also how people respond effectively. It just balances out the information that people get so that they're not only aware of the diagnosis of the problems, they're aware of the various options for responding and which ones are better and why.
Yeah, I guess another response might be, is in terms of propagating information about solutions, and just to do a little plot spoiler, I mean, that's kind of what you do, right? I mean, your network is about finding successful responses. It's not the only thing you do, but one big thing is finding examples of successful responses to problems and shining a light on those, so that they get word about them spreads. That's a big part of what you're doing, right? I'll confirm with you before I move on to the question.
Totally. And there's a few caveats. Very often you can learn from why things aren't working. So a story that looks at a response that was partially effective or ineffective or effective in one way but not in another is really useful information. So there's very few solutions to anything. There's always responses, different levels of effectiveness and different levels of evidence. And sometimes what's missing is that there's no awareness about the problem. There's no sense of urgency. So the first thing is to say what's missing. If people aren't aware of the problem, if they didn't know global warming existed, or they didn't know that it was a serious, urgent problem, then you would want to do a whole bunch of stories to tell people and warn them. But once people have read 100 stories about global warming, typically what's missing is what can we do about it? Where's the efficacy? And in fact, if you do more and more of just more urgent stories, you can actually cause people to tune out, which is what the research on global warming coverage has shown.
Yeah. So what I was going to ask was, isn't it the case, though, that often the people who are going to need to fix the problems, I mean, let's assume we've had a kind of a healthy cycle of negative news. There's some big problem that's underappreciated. Test scores are going down, although I'm personally not a test score obsessive. But that aside, let's suppose there's some kind of evidence that the schools are failing, and so public pressure on the school board grows. The school board's going to do something about it. I would assume at that point, I mean, these are specialists. There's a superintendent of schools. There's people whose job is to be on the school board. I would assume that they are plugged into networks of information above and beyond the newspaper and the the news on TV and so on. I would assume that it's actually their job to have access to a different channel of information about what is working, what's not. But maybe that's naive, and we really do have to resort to like the New York Post to inform, God forbid, to inform the superintendent of schools in New York. You take the question.
We were totally surprised by this too. One of our early projects was something that was supported by the California Healthcare Foundation, and they asked us to do a solutions journalism project looking at how counties around California and in other parts of the country were responding to a whole bunch of health problems. And they wanted to bring those ideas together and create a set of memos for county health commissioners. And we asked them, don't they already know this stuff? And it turned out the answer was no. They are actually not very good at gathering stories. There's 3,300 counties in the United States. Even if 2 or 3% are doing something really smart about opioids or about diabetes or whatever, that's 100 places that have something to teach 3,200 places. The idea that these networks exist to cross-pollinate the ideas and to share them quickly is a hope, but it's actually not a reality, and actually the general news can often be a good seed scatterer of ideas. But the other piece of that is, in order to do smarter things in the schools or to get the public to want to, use tax dollars to improve any public institution, people have to believe that change is possible, that the system is not fatally broken, and it's just better to send your kids to private schools and let the public system, fall apart. And that's a big problem today too. There's a real lack of belief that problems can be solved, and people just don't want to put money into things.
Yeah. So to get back just briefly to the Trump question before we talk more about what you're doing and talk about some other things. There's a way to state your argument that I think makes it sound a little condescending. In other words, these people who voted for Trump in the heartland, they think that they have these problems that Trump is supposed to address. They think the system has not been serving them, but they're just confused. It's just that there's a negativity bias in the news, and if they would really take a more objective appraisal of their situation, they would calm down. That's if I were one of those people, I might find that claim, at least stated that way, a little bit offensive. You may have heard this argument already, but you take my point. And also, I do believe, look, the media is very important in shaping our worldview, but it's also true that people are, the leading experts on what their lives are actually like, and so I think you have to attach some credence to their accounts or credibility. But what do you say to all that?
I think that it's good to present people with a menu of options. If you're in a community that, where has really seen declining economic mobility and seen stagnation, and you want to know what your options are to make America great again, to have your life back, one of them might be, let's build a wall and keep foreigners from coming into this country. That's one option. One of them, but then there may be dozens of other options that actually might work in terms of rebuilding a Rust Belt economy, or, getting back to, agriculture that is regenerative and the land is working again for you, or whatever, what have you. The question is that Trump presented a bunch of options to people that seemed really good. And, and if you actually scour the newspapers for what are the other options we have for dealing with the globalization, or people who need to be retrained for jobs for an information economy out from an older economy jobs, there wasn't a lot that was presented to people about different ways that America is rebuilding the American dream. And so I think that what happens is people who come out with what appear to be solutions like that are competing against an open field. There's not a lot of other ideas about ways we could potentially solve problems that other politicians or other news organizations are credibly, not just espousing, but saying, look, here's 5 communities that have actually really, revived their communities, and this is how they did it. And they didn't do it by banning immigrants. They actually did it by welcoming immigrants. So that's the kind of thing that would create a better competition for ideas, where I think you can trust people to be able to know, to vote their interests. I certainly don't think that people are stupid and did not vote their interests, but I do think that people were voting in a poverty, in an environment where there was an impoverishment of ideas.
Yeah. Let me throw one more thing out about Trump that's related to Trump, and this is maybe just kind of a pet obsession of mine or something, but if you ask me what's wrong with journalism, I would say one thing is that, and I think this is partly caused by Trump and partly was starting to happen before him, but I think there's been a departure from, I guess, journalists' commitment to the straight news reporting model. Not that true objectivity was ever possible. And not that, journalists didn't have their biases that they weren't aware of. And not that there weren't journalists who consciously exercised biases. But there was more, I think, just in the journalistic voice itself, more of an effort to try a sense that the person was trying to be objective. Just a straightforward reporting of what happened. This person said this person said that. I think, I'm obviously not the first to suggest that in the age of Trump, there has been an injection of kind of attitude into the coverage. CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, all seem, some more than others, MSNBC, kind of anti-Trump, right? And not just in their kind of opinion stuff or their commentary, but really in their presentation of the news. I don't think I'm imagining this. I'm certainly not the only person who believes it. And it seems to me the disservice that does is it really does. I mean, it's funny. There are a lot of forces in society right now, it seems, and in technology that are conspiring to make us wonder if we can trust anybody, right? The way social media can be manipulated, various things. But it seems to me this is one thing that sows distrust in the media in ways that play into the hands of a Donald Trump and play into the hands of cynical politicians on the other side, for that matter. And I know this may not be central. It's definitely not central to what you're about. But before we move on to what's central to what you're about, does this make sense to you? It's really a concern of mine.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what happened with Trump especially, but I mean, I don't know if it only began with him, is this, I think journalists got enormously frustrated that nothing they wrote seemed to make a difference. And so there was this kind of like, it's kind of like the school teacher talking to the kids and they're not listening and just ratcheting up the volume. And I think it gets to the question of trust in a different way. Like, why aren't people paying attention, or why are certain people not paying attention at all and other people believe everything we say? And I think it gets to the question of what really creates trust. And sort of the idea in journalism is that we fact check. We're accurate. You should trust us. And so, and it turns out that, trust is a function of relationships as much as it's a function of are you accurate? I mean, obviously the facts are important, but people tend to trust people that they think have their backs. That idea that, I don't care what you know until I know that you care is true. And so journalists' helpfulness is a really important part of whether people will trust them. Are we genuinely helping people by providing them information that really helps them navigate their lives, improve their communities, build a better world, achieve their dreams, all that stuff? Is the information we're providing doing that, helping them? And are we showing our work? Are we showing really how we made these decisions, how we gathered this information? Those are the kinds of things that help with trust. And our argument, and some of the things that we found with some of our partners, is that when the news organizations start integrating into the mix solutions journalism, so that they're not just covering the opioid crisis, or they're not just covering the homelessness crisis, they're also saying, here's 5 models that we've found of different ways communities can become safer or can do better against addiction or mental health. The public actually responds to that with a kind of sense of gratitude, and that builds trust. And I think that's the thing that in recent years has, with 24/7 media, there's so much information that creates a sense of anxiety or alarms people or makes them feel that the world is spinning out of control and is unbelievably dangerous, without much information that really builds a sense of here's what people are doing, here's how responses are happening. And so I think that in certain places that can erode trust. And I think that has led to some of the more extreme efforts by journalists, especially in the Trump era to really get our message across. Just more strident voices or more rhetoric, rather than just straight reporting, as you've said.
Okay, and after this Trump-related question, I promise, really, this time I will get into your mission. But do you agree that, at least to some extent, kind of American elites prior to Trump had not fully taken on board the way things like globalization, the outsourcing of jobs, the automation to some extent, immigration, and the actual kind of short-term competition that can create for low-wage work, and technological changes. Do you think American elites had really failed to take account of some genuinely negative impacts that was having in certain parts of America, and that there was a little actual education to be done that for better or worse, Donald Trump did?
Oh, yeah,
in a certain sense. I mean, not that he would articulate it even as well as I just did, which wouldn't be a very high bar, but you know what I mean. He is this like giant canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, I kind of see him as a national angiogram. I think he just flows through, showing wherever a weakness is in the system. I mean, in some sense, that's his helpfulness. But yeah, 100%. When we go to rural communities, I mean, we work with about more than 200 news organizations across the country now. And when we've gotten into other parts of the country and you've said, hey, so what do you think about, the media coverage, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the big national outlets, do you think that they're accurate? And people generally say, yeah, you're accurate, but you kind of make us look like a bunch of ignorant yahoos. This was said in Alabama. Well, what do you mean? Well, you only really cover us when, Roy Moore is running or something like that. We don't get covered around the issues. We don't get shown in our fullness. We don't get reflected in a way that we feel respected and really seen. And I think that that's both, we're not really covering or caring about our problems. There wasn't that much said, I think in all the 8 years of Obama, there really wasn't that much talked about with regard to poverty. For example. I think that also people don't get seen through the lens of their capacities as well, certainly through the national news sources. Mm-hmm. So I think, I think that that's a totally valid critique.
Okay, so now do tell us a little more about what you actually do, how you go about attacking the problem as you see the problem.
Yeah, it's really very simple. I mean, solutions journalism is just basically saying, if you can cover a problem, if you can cover a school that has a bullying problem, you're also allowed to cover a school that is doing something to try to reduce its bullying problem. If you can cover a community that has racial profiling, you can also cover a police force that has tried to reduce its racial profiling. And the question is just looking at how is this community or how is this organization or institution responding to the problem? What are they doing? Is there evidence that what they're doing is effective? And if so, what can we learn from it? And the idea is just reporting on responses. And of course, you want to, there's no one response that's best usually. Every response has its limitations. Sometimes the ones that are most politically feasible are the cheapest ones and often not the most effective, but they're the ones that have a chance to perhaps get supported. The Rolls-Royce solutions that are great are typically the ones that can't be scaled but are working really well with 20 people kind of things. Mm-hmm. And then you have all sorts of, questions about why they work and how they work and what the teachable lessons are. And do we really know they work? And what if we follow up a year from now? Will the data still show that they're still working? So the idea of solutions journalism is to integrate into the news. When you're reporting on any issue in your community, you can also ask the question, is anyone doing better against this issue? And like I said, in a country like the United States or in the world, the chances that your community has a problem are very high. The chances that your community may have one of the better models are actually quite low unless you're New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco. So there's often really interesting opportunities to look at other places and to see, how did Cleveland respond to this problem? One of the news organizations we worked with was the Cleveland Plain Dealer that had a whole series on lead paint exposure in Cleveland. They ended up reporting on how Rochester had actually done a really good job reducing its lead paint exposure. And they needed travel money to go to Rochester, and they brought back these stories that we call howdunnits. They're sort of like detective stories.
So did you provide them the travel money?
For other things, yeah. We have, we provide sub-grants to news organizations, often for travel or often for engagement. We try not to pay for journalism itself, because that's something that news organizations, we don't want to create dependency. But typically, a news organization will come to us and say, we want to do a project on mental health issues. Like we have a bunch of news organizations in Western Montana that were reporting on mental health because they were seeing a lot of issues related to that. And many of them wanted to look at what other communities were doing that were showing promise. And so often we would provide a sub-grant that's basically travel funds to go report on something elsewhere and then bring that idea back to their community. Typically, they'll bring a bunch of different models back to their community and then have a conversation about it. Do any of these models apply to us? Should we pursue them? Should we explore them? And the idea is to put options on the table so that you can actually you can deliberate. And the conversation, the idea is it's journalism that once the problem has been reported and people are aware that problem exists, they care about it. The question is, how do you move the conversation from how did we get here and who's to blame to what are our options? What can we do about it? What should we be looking at? And that's where the solutions journalism approach can really bring new life to a story that otherwise will just keep on circling on itself.
Okay, so one of the main things you want to do is take a place where there's a problem that has not been solved and raise awareness in that area, in that vicinity, about ways the problem has been solved or at least been mitigated. Is that kind of and the idea is that will make the local authorities more likely to implement the solution or something closer to a solution. Is that kind of the core of what you do?
Yeah, very much. And sometimes there are good ideas in the community itself that are under-recognized. But the basic idea is that you want to take a problem that people think of as unavoidable, and you want to get them to see it as unacceptable. That's what really sharpens the teeth of the watchdog. And you really have to take away people's excuses, because typically when news organizations do investigations or traditional journalism, the people that they're criticizing, the public authorities, often public officials, have a whole series of excuses. We don't have enough money. There's a blame the victim narrative that often happens. And the best way to take away excuses is to just show, well, here's 3 other places that have actually done something smarter, and it's not that much more expensive, and it's promising. It may not even be working 100%. It may be just showing promise or showing some interim results. But the idea is you have to move people away from a kind of turning your hands up to the sky, what should we do about this, to a kind of, to be activated by the idea. You're almost wanting to create a bit of FOMO. Like, why is it that other places are actually doing something about this and we're still sitting on our hunches? Mm-hmm. And so that really, it is an accountability mechanism in that sense. It really works well when it is combined with investigative or traditional journalism, because the punch of investigation hits, but then you also take away the excuses, and then you also give people, a sense that there are places that they could be looking at.
Okay. So do you want to just give us kind of a list of issue areas where you think you've made inroads? You don't have to describe the inroads, but just to give people a sense of the breadth of the policy issues you cover. You've mentioned, the problem of lead in the water in Cleveland. Was that it?
Yeah. Lead paint.
Lead paint in Cleveland. What are some other? What's a list of issues that would give us some sense of the breadth?
Yeah. So we've done a lot. We've had a lot of news organizations do projects on what works to improve public schools, basically, public education. We had a big project of news organizations around the country that looked at the question of what is working to reduce or prevent violence, and that led to hundreds of stories, and they ranged from people looking at things in the justice system, to people looking at what works to reduce toxic stress in families, which is something that really inhibits, healthy development of children, to what works to reduce sort of the school to prison pipeline through the suspension system and all that. There have been people who news organizations that have looked at a lot of mental health and addiction. We have something called the Solution Story Tracker, where we have about 8,000 stories that we've found. Many of these come from news organizations we've worked with and done some trainings with, but we also just find things because we have a lot of online curriculum, and we don't necessarily. And then you try to get journalists to use the tracker. Is that its main function in the course of their research? Yeah. So there's like 150 stories in that, or something of that. We can link to that on the bloggingheads.tv site. Of the 8,000, there's maybe 150 about related to the opioid crisis. So if you're writing about that, one thing you can do is just see like what's been written about this, how are communities responding. But if you're a community that's struggling with this, it's a great place to sort of look at the shop floor of society and see what are other places doing about this problem. And so you might get ideas there, or you might be surprised that other communities have actually seen progress in reducing overdoses or responding better to overdoses. Mm-hmm. So universities, academic institutions, policy shops, really anyone who's interested in learning about what are ideas out there that may be showing promise, mm-hmm. are potential users of that. Okay. So I guess there's a lot of ways that solutions to problems can be depicted. I mean, there's a lot of forums in which they can be depicted. There's journal articles, there's industry newsletters, there's all kinds of things. And you're just focusing on the particular incarnation that we call journalism, right? I mean, that's so journalism is both, it's both your target audience and it's your content, right? Yeah. So there's kind of like, we have two separate sort of sections of our organization. We're a nonprofit. One of them is really about changing, we call it practice change. It's about helping journalists integrate this into their normal practice. So we work with news organizations, and we also work with individual journalists. We have a hub, an online network with about 5,000 journalists who have signed up to that. And then the other thing is we call knowledge dissemination, where we capture these stories, then we kind of group them into categories, and then we help universities and other places see, basically have access to that knowledge so that they could learn from other people's experimentation. And journalism is a quick and dirty capture mechanism. It's not nearly as rigorous as a randomized controlled trial. I mean, a journalist is not, looking for the same level of evidence as somebody would look like if they're going to create policy. But, they still are trying to get it right in most cases, and they are looking for evidence, and they are trying to capture the limitations so that it's not a puff piece. So it tends to be a pretty solid way of looking at, what are things we can learn from other places. Yeah. So you basically, a lot of what you do is organize information that's out there already. By no means are you just about the information you're helping to generate, right? You're finding information that's out there about solutions, organizing it, and then kind of evangelizing to journalists to get them to tap into the information infrastructure you're building. That's a lot of it. Yeah. So the story tracker is it's kind of a resource for journalists who want to see, one, what does this look like when it's done? What does a solution story look like? How is it different? Most of what we do is training. We're primarily a training organization. We basically, a lot of the issues that come up, how do you structure narratives? Where do you put the conflict in a solution story? Is it different than a traditional story? So you're actually telling them how to make solutions appealing in a literary way, to turn a solution into a good read. Yeah. How do you make this not boring? How do you make this not feel like a hero story or a silver bullet story? We have something we call the solutions journalism imposters. Hero worship, silver bullet, stories that come across like advocacy. Any bad solutions journalism is just bad. It's puffery. It's not to be taken seriously. People people, it's a threat to this idea of being taken seriously in journalism because people immediately see it, and it just feels like it's just a good news story.
But you're fighting pretty strong winds there, it seems to me. I mean, there's a reason that the hero motif is so pervasive. People seem to want to read it, right? They want there to be this one star genius person. It must be hard because in that case, I was saying, I asked, so you're making solutions more kind of literarily appealing, better reads, but in this case, you're actually kind of encouraging them in a sense to make it a less enticing read, right? You're encouraging reporters to not do the thing that will make this appealing in at least the way these things are usually made appealing, right?
Well, this is the sort of the surprising thing. I mean, we tend to think that these kind of CNN hero stories are what people want when we talk about, good news or solutions. People really like stories that get into problem solving. It's kind of just like people like to do Sudoku or like to read detectives books. People are curious about, I think the detective story is the most popular narrative form in the world, or one of them. People really dig how is this person going to solve this problem? How is Harry going to get out of this mess? How is Hermione going to get out of this mess? I mean, I read 4,000 pages of Harry Potter out loud to my son, and it was one problem-solving situation after another with you strung along wondering how are they going to solve this? And then, of course, it all culminates with the big how-to, which is like, how is Harry going to defeat Voldemort? But if you look at the procedurals on TV, CSI, Law and Order, any of these things, they're all basically detective stories. And if you watch for the first 2 minutes, you're hooked. So there's something very appealing about stories that pull you along through curiosity. And
but isn't part of that narrative, as it typically appeals to people, that there is this one thing that is the key to everything, right? Which in the realm of solutions is sometimes too simple, right? I mean, you take my point that it's a little isn't the detective narrative related to the hero narrative in the sense that there's this one thing that turns out to be the answer to everything?
Well, in each story, you might focus on one dimension of the solution. So, like if I say, here's a story about a school that reduced its bullying problem, and you're like, and it's really interesting how they did it. And then I go to the commercial break. If you care about that, you might stick around and say, I wonder how they did it. And if I'm a good storyteller, I won't give that away right away. I'll pull you along because the answer can't be given in the first paragraph. And if I say here's another school that did something even, very different in a different context, each story has its own sort of how done it narrative. There's no one answer, but And typically when news organizations get into solutions journalism, they don't just do one story to sort of how to teach reading to ninth graders, and then we've solved it. They're often doing, dozens and dozens of stories over time to show that there's many different sort of smart ideas or hacks to systems that people are using. There's creativity coming from the edges in all different places, coming from teachers, principals.
And what are some of the best ways to stop or reduce bullying?
Oh, some of the best ways to reduce bullying are, through things like what's the approach that they use in a lot of schools? I forget what it's called. It's called shoot, you're spacing it out now.
That's okay. You don't need. I mean, if you can describe it without the label, that's fine. But if you don't. But if you've spaced out...
It's essentially an approach that teaches morals to young people in a very effective way. It's, gosh, I'm spacing it out, but it was used... I know the Seattle Times wrote extensively about this in a series that they did on suspensions of young kids. And they found examples of where it was working well and examples of where it wasn't working well. The phrase will come to me.
Now, is that a case where the Seattle reporters kind of found this and that's what brought your attention to it, or did you play a role in their reporting? No,
they found it. They did a big investigation looking at, I think it's called restorative justice, I think. I'm trying to remember the name of the model, but basically what they did is they did a big investigative piece where they showed that young children of color were being suspended at considerably higher rates than white kids in the public schools. And they were able to show that it was much, much higher. So there was clearly racism involved. And what they found was that when the teachers sort of knew that this was happening in the schools, it sort of landed like a lead weight on the city. And very shortly after that, the city banned suspensions of elementary school students. But then the teachers, said, we still have to have ways to deal with misbehavior. And so they started looking at other models, and sort of this restorative justice model was one of the ones that they looked at. And they found examples of schools that were really just paying lip service to it, and schools that were actually doing quite well at it, and why it worked. And they looked at the how-tos. And so then they went deeper. They actually started looking at the role of trauma and what they call ACEs. The ACE score is a measure of childhood trauma. It stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so as they were peeling the onion, they got to deeper levels of causality of what really leads to misbehavior among 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds. It typically is stuff in the family. And then they started looking at things that are known to work or to reduce ACEs, to reduce these exposures to trauma. And so it was this really interesting continual hunt for going deeper into the causes of a problem. And looking at what do we know about it, what are the things that have actually shown to be effective.
So is restorative justice when the perpetrator kind of makes it up to the victim? They do something to the victim by way of compensating for the wrong they've done them, or is that because that's done in some cultures? Yes,
that's part of it, and it's also part of understanding the effect of your behavior on other people and on the feelings of safety of other people in the whole group. So it's really grounded in the idea that especially children don't always realize how their actions affect others. And the idea, it's almost looking at, rather than looking at punishment as the solution to a problem, it's basically saying, what is missing here? What is the child not really understanding and not really feeling that if that child understood it, probably would control its behavior differently if the child can control its behavior. If not, in some cases, you have children who are what they call dysregulated because they've had a lot of trauma, and then there's other ways of dealing with that as well. But just suspending a 7-year-old kid is it makes no sense whatsoever. It's not a solution at all. It's not a correction system. It's just a punishment,
Okay.
Yeah.
So 2 things you do are you kind of try to bring journalists in touch with existing journalistic accounts of things that have worked. Another is that you actually go out and teach journalists how to write about solutions in an honest yet alluring way.
Yeah.
Are those?
We don't give them ideas. We never tell them what to write about, and we don't suggest models. We don't say you should write about this model or that model. But we have this resource which is very rich, which is full of ideas that they can look at.
And you go around like holding like tutorials at places or what?
Yeah, well, no, news organizations typically reach out to us and ask us to do trainings. Sometimes we have projects, and we'll put out a call for proposals on our website saying if news organizations are interested in using a solutions journalism approach to look at the question of what works to renew democracy or to ensure that citizens have fair access to the ballot box, which is one of the things that we've done recently. If you want to report on that issue, we have a project. We offer training. We have sub-grants if you're interested in traveling to look at these stories. So typically, news organizations will propose ideas to us, but we won't come into a news organization and do a training unless the editors and the reporters ask for it. It doesn't make any sense. We've come in a few times when one editor wanted it, but the reporters didn't really want it, and it didn't work at all. So it has to be really, people have to be genuinely interested in it. But we have more people coming to us than we can meet now. So it's the idea is gaining more and more legitimacy.
Do you get accused of having an ideological bias, whether an intentional one or a kind of de facto one? I mean, is there like a a stereotype critique of you?
I mean, the biggest problem that we have, the biggest critique is our name, Solutions Journalism Network. I mean, people just say, we're not in the business of picking winners. We're not in the business of advocating for solutions. And we say, well, that's not what we're about. And they say, well, that's what it sounds like from your name. And what we said is, we were going to call ourselves the Responses to Problems Journalism Network, but that just didn't seem like a very good name. It's really just reporting on how people are responding to problems. Because, as I said, most of these responses have strengths and weaknesses, strengths and limitations. So the main critique is the presumption that we're in the business of sort of asking journalists to push ideas and advocate for ideas and to pick winners and all that stuff. In terms of liberal conservative, we work with a lot of news organizations around the country that are in red counties, red states, purple counties, blue states. And what we have found is that, I mean, in some ways it's like, there's two ways of sort of getting to truth. There's the lawyer way, which is two sides arguing with each other. And then there's the engineering way, or the scientist's way, which is sort of trying to do something in the world and seeing what happens. Solutions journalism is probably closer to getting to truths through the second. And so it's not as polarizing as the typical for and against model.
Okay. Did you, you said you work in red states, red counties. Has that given you insights into the roots of Trumpism or the roots of support for Trumpism? Or did it give you kind of an advance notice of the thing? Do you feel that has led you personally to be a little more plugged into what actually is going on in America, political sentiment wise?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when we go to these news organizations, we ask them what their problems are, and there's really serious, there's a lot of mental health issues that come up, a lot of issues related to economic mobility and people feeling like they just, can't get a fair shake. There's a lot of feelings that journalists look down upon them and don't really respect them. And there's a lot of feelings that when they get quoted, they look like fools in the articles because the journalists just take the most incendiary thing that they say, whether it's lock her up or build the wall or whatever it is. And I think, we actually have a new program that we started. We call it Complicating the Narratives. We probably have to come up with a better name. But what we did was we asked a journalist to spend 3 months with conflict mediators just to see how they listen and how they ask questions, because the conflict mediators are in the business of trying to make sure that people can actually, people who really hate each other in some cases can come together and talk to each other. And we found that one of the main things that they do is they make sure that when they interview people, that the people that they've interviewed feel that their ideas are captured really accurately. There's a thing that they do called looping, where they won't stop until the person says, yes, exactly. You got me exactly. Mm-hmm. And we have started training journalists in this approach, in learning how to actually interview and listen in the way that mediators do. And the ones that we've trained said it really makes a difference, that they're, it's kind of like unclogging your stethoscope. It's like you're trying to get someone's heartbeat and you don't realize that you're actually not really getting what they mean. The person who says something very, very like build the wall might really mean, 30 years ago when my father came back from the war, people spit on him. So you find that a viewpoint is grounded very often in someone's emotions and in someone's lived experience. And when you really understand where that view comes from, you cover it in a very, very different way than just sort of the soundbite. Mm-hmm. That's one of the main things that we've found over and over. It's just how often people feel that the news media just does not really take the time to really understand what they care about.
Yeah, although there's also the issue of people, I mean, just speaking as a sometime journalist who a long time ago worked at an actual newspaper, and since then, I've done magazine pieces and so on. There's also just sometimes, a lack of understanding that my job in writing this particular story is actually not to present your life story. Like you are one person I talk to. There's no way that what comes out in the story is going to be representative of the conversation we had. That's not always an adequate excuse for the person feeling cheated, because the truth is, sometimes journalists are very cynical, and I've been one of these. I mean, where you're really just looking for like one quote at this point. You can kind of see your story, So there are certainly, in other words, well, in any event, I guess I'm just saying that the best intentioned of journalists are often not going to give people they interview what the people are expecting.
Yeah.
And then there's the fact that very few journalists are the best intentioned of all possible journalists. But you see what I mean, right? There's almost an inherent problem in there's almost necessarily going to be a sense among kind of sources, people who have been interviewed, that they haven't been fully served. And to some extent that can just represent their misunderstanding of what has to happen in journalism. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's, and yet, I mean, we're 4 years into, almost 4 years into this presidency, and I have a lot of liberal friends. I live in New York City. If I ask them, they cannot fathom, they still cannot understand why 60 million people voted for this guy. Yeah. And why so many people are not interested or will deny climate change. They just cannot understand it. So we've now covered this for years without really understanding what's really driving this. Who are these people? Are they, there's this kind of sense that like these people must be crazy or they must be less compassionate than I am and all that. There's people just go to this, and for to have a system of gathering information for years and years and years, day in, day out, that's still not producing basic understandings about what is really motivating people and all that, is a massive failure. And I think it really does, some of it goes to methods, I think, which is what we're talking about, journalistic methods. How do we actually cover people? How do we really try to get inside people's motivations? And I mean, there have been good stories here and there that have gone deep into that, and some books that have been very helpful. But in general, I was sort of surprised when I did this training, by the way, this mediation training that I'm mentioning, this stuff that I was sort of surprised at how often I had made the mistakes that were, talked about in this training, about how you can, even when we interviewed our friends in the organization, our peers, how easy it was to misunderstand what your coworker really meant in their quotes. As soon as you played it back, you said, so what I'm hearing is blah, 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 blah. Is that what you meant? No, that's not what I meant. You misunderstood. I mean, right from the get-go, with someone who you see every day that you know and you think you understand, misunderstandings are so commonplace. And I really think that journalism really needs to understand how to do better at getting people.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you as kind of a closing question. Well, one of the big problems that we've kind of alluded to already, I mean, you look at solutions to a lot of problems. One of the big problems is the political polarization that Trump kind of represents. And I was going to ask, are you addressing that as a problem? Is that like could I find that on your website? I probably couldn't. I don't know. Maybe I could. Political polarization as a problem. It's not the same kind of problem that, test scores or lead in paint or it's not that kind of problem, but everyone agrees it's a problem. Now, I think one thing you're suggesting is that you have kind of learned that part of the problem is a lot of people feeling that they're not being understood, and that much is said about it. I mean that people in Middle America feel that these East Coast elites don't understand them and or don't care about them. But one thing I guess you're suggesting is that part of the solution would be a more nuanced, attentive journalistic technique.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we have, on our blog, we have this essay, Complicating the Narratives, that I mentioned, which was written by Amanda Ripley, and another site that looks at 22 questions that journalists can ask that are helpful in sort of getting underneath people. But Amanda Ripley, who wrote that essay, she's done some great reporting for The Atlantic, which has shown that people, liberals think that conservatives are far more conservative than they really are, and conservatives think that liberals are far more liberal than they really are. We have very flawed ideas about the people on the other side of the fence, and these are caricatures that are not real, that are not realistic. If we really understood truly that most people are shades of gray or shades of purple and not one primary color or the other, the polarization would be less. But these caricatures surface over and over in the news, and they're useful for journalists. They're quick, they're tropes, they're foils. They don't take that much time to report, and that's a problem because people have to do things really quickly. But I think that a lot of that kind of reporting has contributed to the polarization today. That's not the only thing that's contributed to it, but I think it's reinforced and sort of calcified it.
Mm-hmm. So I guess finally, I have to ask you how formidable you have found kind of market forces in a sense. I mean, at the end of the day, newspapers want to sell copies, websites want clicks, and these facts impose real constraints on what journalists can do, right? The best intentioned of journalists, somebody who wants to do a full-fledged, deep, probing interview of everyone who's relevant to the story. I mean, first of all, there's constraints on their time, that are actually intensified by the economic condition of journalism. They've got to put out more copy per hour of labor than used to be the case, probably in a lot of cases. But anyway, the best intentioned journalist ultimately is going to be judged by how many clicks they get. I mean, at least at many, many news outlets, and to some extent, even at the finest of news outlets, that's going to be something that they have to think about a lot. And I've got to think that this sometimes at least gets frustrating for you.
Well, the thing that's actually surprising and exciting for us is that we have gotten reports from our partners around the country that this solutions journalism surprisingly often plays better. That when they look at things like time on page or clicks or shares on social media, these stories, and there's been some research that some universities have done that bear this out. It's not, I wouldn't say it's overwhelming research, but we actually have a project going now that is looking at ways that news organizations can increase their revenues by integrating solutions journalism into the mix. And we already have seen a number of news organizations around the country bring in new sources of revenues through local philanthropy, through community foundations, through local business sponsorship of it. And the idea is that it goes back again to the news product. If you're showing a community that, hey, like one of our partners is this news organization called the Richland Source, which is in north central Ohio in a rural area. They've done a whole bunch of series where they've looked at the Rust Belt economy, caring for our elders, how do we deal with flooding, how do we take care of our children, how do we build food security for our community, where they've both investigated the problem, they've described it, and then they've brought a solutions journalism frame to it in order to surface ideas and models that could be helpful. When they went to the community and said, will you guys pay for this? Local businesses, that is, they were surprised by how many people stepped up and said, absolutely. So the idea that the news is an information source that it's not hard to argue for its value. Now, obviously, good investigation is really important, but if you only stop there, people are left with, but what do we do about it? And if you also can help inform that conversation, not advocating for ideas, but inform that conversation, tee up ideas that become part of it, we're finding that news organizations are beginning to see that this may actually be part of the solution to the revenue problems. So we're actually testing that out now and over the next year or two, and we hope that, we'll have some good indications that it actually is working.
Okay, well, great. Well, I encourage people to go to your website.
I found a few Chinese restaurants near you. The first one is Great Wall Restaurant at 45 George Dye Road, Hamilton Square. The second one is Great Wall at 8 Reading Road, number 104.
I guess at this point you just want to unplug your Google Mini. I'm trying to figure out, I did say okay, but I don't think that was followed by a word even remotely like Google. Anyway, maybe I should ask you a Google-related question in closing.
By the way, you can on your Google Mini, you can say, "Hey Google, tell me something good," and it will read solutions journalism to you.
Will it?
Yeah.
Wait, you mean that command, that generic command, will lead it to you guys?
Yeah.
You're kidding.
No.
Well, that means plugging it back in. I will try it. I mean, let's do a live demo. I'm not sure if it'll like reboot immediately, but let's see. So the phrase is, "Tell me something good." Let's see.
Yeah. Hey Google or okay Google.
Hey Google, tell me something good. Google's thinking.
Can't hear it.
Well, that's because it played on my phone this time. Let me get my phone so people can hear it. They are talking about you. Just a second.
Doesn't come to mind.
But it's too darn hot in Missoula, Montana. Missoula is getting warmer, with average temperatures expected to climb 2 to 5.
They're talking about Missoula, but this is your thing, right?
Like a lot, but higher temperatures mean heat waves will come more often and last longer. And heat waves can be dangerous. They can cause heat cramps and heat stroke or even death.
So this is like a podcast you produce or what?
Extreme heat.
Yeah.
You're nodding. I will tell our audio audience. The witness is affirming.
The city sits in a
Okay.
It's a 90-second brief.
when residents throw open their windows to cool.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Before I go, I'd like to know how satisfied you are with Tell Me Something Good.
I'm
What's the worst?
giving it a 10. I'm giving it a 10, but listen, gotta run.
So what that does is if you say, "Hey Google."
Now wait, I'm actually. Oh wait, I took my earplugs out, so I can't. Hang on.
Okay.
Hang on, David. You can keep talking, and the audience can hear you. It's just that I can't until now. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I can see. So if you say, "Hey Google, tell me something good," what it does is you get a 90-second sort of summary of a story, and then a link to that story or a link to our solution story tracker on your phone.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys this is a serious operation, I've got to say. I have not managed to finagle a single dedicated, Bob Wright Google voice command. There's nothing you can say that will automatically lead to this podcast or anything. So that's impressive. And you do, I was just saying, when Google intervened that, people should go to your site because it clearly is a substantial operation. The Solutions Journalism Network. You got a lot of people, a lot of philanthropic support. So congratulations. Should also mention your book again, How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas. Where, do you have a Twitter handle or anything where people can find you?
So the Solutions Journalism is at SOL Journo,
Okay.
And I'm at DN Bornstein,
Okay.
I think for people who are interested in solutions, you can go to the Solution Story Tracker and set up an alert and say, "I'm interested in, whatever issue you are, health, education," and you can get, there's a newsletter called The Response. You can just hear about things that people are doing related to different issues that you care about. There's also something that we have called Solutions U, where we create sort of like playlists of solution stories around issues, like around climate change or various other issues. So if you're interested in sort of looking at these collections, the idea is just to kind of be able to look at the world through the lens of adaptation and responses out there, which typically receive a lot less coverage than the problems themselves, and that creates a real distortion. So I think it's not to make people sort of like be optimistic. I want to get back to the optimism pessimism thing. If I could just, we're not in the, like a lot of times people say, well, yeah, we need more good news. And I don't think we should be in the business of managing people's affect. I don't think this is about making people feel better after a hard day or whatever. It's about what is the kind of information that really helps society self-correct. And, you know, like one of the analogies that I use for journalism is that it's like a 30-minute doctor's appointment where the doctor spends 29 minutes and 40 seconds telling you how sick you are and leaves the last 20 seconds of the appointment to tell you there may be treatment options. Mm-hmm. If you continue to give people information presented in that ratio, you're going to have predictable effects. People are going to feel pretty anxious and people pretty fearful, and many will disengage and there'll be news avoidance, which is a problem we're seeing. But you're also going to create a really false and impoverished view of your options and what people can really do about things. And that doesn't activate people. That's not what really helps in a democracy, to have people participate and make better choices. Okay.
That makes sense. So you're, yeah. So, but this does, I do encourage, I mean, that picks up on the previous conversation I had, the one with Zachary Karabell. I do, encourage people to listen to that too, because it's related to the question you just raised, although, it's a very different discussion.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, David, and congratulations on what you built with Tina Rosenberg, and, continued good luck.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. Great speaking with you.
Okay. See you around.